Good evening. I am Ann Brooke, the director of Art Presence Art Center. One of my favorite authors said, "In life, expect transformation." There have been almost 9 years of dramatic change and growth from a county jail to a premier fine art gallery. We are proud to feature guest artists of many mediums and a membership of incredible professionals in watercolor, oil, acrylic, photography, fabric, and glass. The Galleria, an area of handmade gifts, which includes woodwork, jewelry, clay, handmade items, lamps, and decorator items, is another of our features. Our website is art-presence.org. You will find the ability to see virtual tours there. Now to the matter at hand. We also have an author section, local writers who have graced our gallery with their creations. Personally, I have read many of our novels and know that I will always have an excellent book on our shelves at Art Presence. Penitentiary Tales is one of those. I was rapt from the beginning. I was there. Even the chapter about the boxing match was exciting and had me on edge. Beautifully written and a hard subject to be so very appealing. And here is Ginna Gordon, Art Presence Art Center board member, book event and manager, author in her own right, and host of these Arts and Letters presentations. Ginna?
Thank you, Anne. And welcome to Arts and Letters, conversations about art, words, and ideas. All audience guests are video and audio muted for Arts and Letters events, so please open your chat windows to communicate with us. I will be monitoring the chat conversations. My guest author at 5 p.m. on Friday, April 9th, will be Judy Hilliard, reading from and discussing her recent release, Soul Companion. Judy is a retired ICU nurse with 47 years experience and 2 master's degrees. At the end of Judy's career, she learned to be an anam cara, a soul friend offering counseling for a peaceful death. Quite a transition. That's Friday, April 9th at 5 p.m. Tonight's guest author is Jean Luetkemeyer. I read Jean's novel, Penitentiary Tales, a love story, in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. When I came up for air, I said, this book should be a bestseller. It's gritty and gnarly and feels true to the bone. Professor John Coggeshall of Clemson University calls Penitentiary Tales, a love story, an insightful and at times darkly disturbing glimpse into an institution rarely entered by most readers. Penitentiary Tales recounts the escapades of Dean Davis, a 30-something educated straight white male from affluent Sausalito in Marin County, California, who was sent to an Illinois prison, which is dominated by a daunting and ethnically diverse population of inmates from the mean streets of Chicago. What we see in this story is how Dean Davis spends his time, what challenges he meets, and we see what he learns about himself and others. Penitentiary Tales addresses race and gender issues of the marginalized and the oppressed, a bit of a romp and a love story. In a moment of sympathy for an inmate doing life without parole, Davis reflects, from my point of view, we were all victims, even the lowest of the low, the most foul, forlorn, and forsaken on the planet, victimized by the lack of a key, by a missing piece, by the absence of a blueprint, an instruction manual, a map of the soul, by too much of one chemical and too little of another. Here now is our friend and colleague, Jean Luetkemeyer, to spend some time with you and share moments from his novel, Penitentiary Tales, a love story. Welcome, Jean.
Well, thank you, Ginna. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Art Presence, for hosting the event. And thank you for all the people who are here who took the time out from their busy schedule to be here. We have attendees from perhaps 6 states. And if Sarah made it from Portugal, where it is 1 o'clock in the morning, and if Christian made it from Armenia, where it is 5 o'clock in the morning, then we have a truly international audience for this reading from my novel, Penitentiary Tales. Let me tell the story behind the story. In the early 70s, which is 50 years ago, and I never thought I'd be saying 50 years ago about anything in my life, but here we are. In the early 70s, I was a student at Southern Illinois University trying to decide what I was going to major in, philosophy, psychology, literature. And at the same time, recreational marijuana use was sweeping the nation from coast to coast. It had come out of the urban enclaves and into the mainstream white middle-class college students. And it was, well, I decided to major in the business of marijuana. It was illegal, of course, and the penalties were great, but so were the opportunities. And so I made a conscious decision to become an outlaw for a while and defy the new prohibition for fun and profit. And it was profitable. I prospered for a number of years, but in the end, ultimately, my little empire came crashing down, and I was charged and convicted with felony possession and sentenced to 10 years in the penitentiary. I spent 2 years appealing, failed appeals, and then I spent 5 years as a fugitive under a phony ID until at the end of those 5 years, my resources had run out and my situation was untenable. And I took the advice of my good friend Emilio one cold gray night in San Francisco, who advised me to take the hard road, meaning it's all over, give it up, and surrendered, which I did. And thank you, Emilio, for the advice. I spent 4 years of my 10-year sentence in a penitentiary, and I regard those years as some of the most memorable and meaningful of my life. I finished my degree while I was in there, and I learned about myself and my fellow man at a very deep level. There was an opportunity to be there in a real situation. And I kept a journal of my experience, hundreds of pages of incidents and anecdotes, character sketches, bits of dialogue, observations, and insights. And when I was released, I took that journal with me. For the next 25 years, I was the compliant, tax-paying citizen of the empire that I had so successfully avoided being during my outlaw days. When I retired from the corporate world, that was in 2012. I was accepted into the MFA in creative writing program at Lesley University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I dusted off my 30-year-old prison journal, and upon it based my master's thesis. And after graduation, after receiving my degree, I spent the next 5 years transforming that thesis into the novel that I will read for you from tonight, which was published on my 71st birthday in 2019. 35 years after it began. The first little passage I'm going to read to you from today, it's called A Bogey Farewell. Our protagonist, Dean Davis, that's the main character. Our protagonist, Dean Davis, his wife, Lucy, and their infant daughter, Lola, have flown from San Francisco to Illinois so that he can surrender in the company of his attorney. Lucy and Lola will stay until he's been assigned to a permanent institution. They will visit once, then they will fly back to California and visit once or twice a year while he does his time. A bogey farewell. We bade our tearful goodbyes in the snow-packed parking lot of my attorney's office in the Mississippi River town of Alton, Illinois. More precisely, she bade a tearful goodbye. Mine was more the cavalier Humphrey Bogart, here's looking at you, kid, variety of farewell. What purpose would be served burdening Lucy with my apprehensions? She'd have hardship enough making a life for herself and the baby without me. It was going to be a long 5 years, and I had to walk through those big iron gates alone, dry-eyed, and determined. We're doing the right thing, I assured her. Your father needs you, and you've got to have a life. You wouldn't have one in this burg, and the winters are a bitch. I can't stand thinking of you all alone, she said. I put my hand over my heart. I won't be alone, I said. You'll be right here. Lola will be almost 6. She said she won't know you. She'll know me, I said. Keep saying, Daddy loves you, Lola. Daddy loves you. Let me hold her, I said. She handed me the baby, bundled against the biting cold. Her cheeks and the tip of her nose were red, but her eyes were round and bright and looked into mine. Daddy loves you, Lola, I said. I kissed her on the nose and the forehead and the lips and handed the bundle back. I felt torn between two worlds. I wanted this moment to be over. I wanted the next phase of my life to begin. I looked over my shoulder at the door to my lawyer's office. I've got to go, I said. Lucy caught her breath. I put my hands on her shoulders. One of us has to turn around and walk away, I said. I don't want to watch you walk away, she said. I'll go first. I don't want to watch you walk away either, I said. Let's turn around and walk away at the same time. All right, she said, and don't look back. I won't, I said. Okay, on 3. 1, 2. Wait, she said. One more kiss. We kissed and I held her and Lola. Please don't let it change you, Dean, she said. I'll be the invisible man, I assured her, out of sight, out of mind. Now turn around, walk away, and don't look back. We each turned around. I walked 20 feet and up 3 steps to the threshold of my attorney's office. I put my hand on the doorknob. I turned around. She had turned around too. The hell with Humphrey Bogart, I thought. I ran down the steps to Lucy and Lola, and she ran to meet me, and we embraced for the last time in a very long time. Now, Dean, after several days in the county jail, has been transferred to a temporary intake facility, Arcadia Correctional Center, where he'll be processed and evaluated and then assigned to a permanent facility. He looks around at his new environment. I stared at the phone on the wall. The word incongruous came to mind. Earlier that day, I'd been checked into Arcadia Correctional Center, an intake facility for the Illinois Department of Corrections. I'd been stripped and searched and straddle-walked butt naked over the delousing spray pipe on the floor. I could still smell the pungent disinfectant wafting up from my groin. I was issued white cotton underwear, blue bib overalls, long john tops and bottoms, scuffed leather work boots, toiletries, and a padlock and a key on a string. I was escorted to the holding cell for new arrivals and assigned a bunk, the top bunk, and a wooden trunk where I stowed my toiletries and the books and yellow legal pads and pens I brought in with me. I sat not pretending to write, while casting cautious glances at a scene worthy of Hieronymus Bosch. 80 bunks in a cracker box of green concrete walls and steel mesh 100 feet long by 30 wide. 40 bunks on each side, 20 up, 20 down. Outside, frigid Midwest winds frosting the fallow fields, but inside, hot air blasting from vents on all sides, causing the green walls to perspire and glisten like the entrails of a slaughtered beast. Overhead lighting so bright it lit the scene in stark relief. 4 television sets mounted high on opposite walls, cranked to the max so you had to yell to be heard. But no one seemed to mind. Least of all the 80 men clad in bib overalls, or in white cotton boxer shorts, or in white towels tied at the hip, who lounged on their bunks reading girly magazines, playing card games, yelling, "Trump that, motherfucker," or who loitered in the narrow aisle between the rows of bunks, posturing, posing, pontificating, greeting partners from the street, catching up on what was happening in the hood. At the far end of the room was a wooden platform beneath 2 shower heads, in front of which a line of men, towel wrapped or in the raw, awaited their turn. And to the left of the platform, on the wall, a telephone. I watched a short, slouching white inmate shuffle to the phone, pick up the receiver and speak. He seemed to be cursing, then slam it down and walk away. I leaned over from my bunk and addressed the 2 black inmates who loitered beside it. "Excuse me," I said. The taller of the 2 glared at me. "Chew on, motherfucker," he snapped. I wasn't sure I'd heard the man right. Was he telling me to chew on something, motherfucker? More likely he'd said, "What do you want, motherfucker?" I would have to fine-tune my ear to the local dialect. "On the wall there," I said with a civil tone, "is that a phone?" "You've been locked up a long time. You don't know what a phone is, fool," he said. "I know what it is," I said, "but who can use it?" "Anybody who want." "Really? Who can you call?" "Call your mama, call your bitch, call anybody anytime. They got the dime, motherfucker." "You mean you got to call collect?" "The fuck you think I mean?" When can you call out?" I said. "All day, every day, sucker." "Thanks," I said. I leaned back in my bunk. I found the presence of the phone disturbing. I had expected to be able to make calls eventually, but figured I'd have to jump through hoops, fill out a form, make an appointment, go to a special room, be timed for 10 minutes, but not all day, every day, anybody, anytime they got the dime, motherfucker. As easy as standing in a phone booth outside a bar, I could call Lucy. But I resisted. Our parting had been painful. I turned my attention to the world around me. And after a long day of in-your-face introduction to his new hostile environment, night finally comes. At 10 o'clock, the televisions went off. A guard entered the pen and walked on the aisle between the rows of bunks. "Lights out in 5 minutes," he yelled. "Time for bed, boys and girls." "Fuck you, Screw," came a defiant reply. "Kiss my ass, peanut butter neck motherfucker," came another. "There's room on the floor of the hole if you'd rather sleep there," said the Screw. Inmates drifted to their bunks. The bright lights went off and 3 small, dull orange bulbs in wire cages came on, casting the long room in a hellish glow. A few men carried on loud conversations like children at a pajama party. Others shouted, "Shut the fuck up!" The guard patrolled the aisle every few minutes. Soon the conversation ceased and the guard came less often. Then the scurrying began. Inmates to the bunks of others, shadows flitting back and forth in the murky orange glow. There came the sound of flesh whacking flesh, of fist on face, of the squeaking of springs, of grunting and moaning, and an insistent voice going, "Come here, you pretty pig." Peace descended. Cigarette tips glowed in the dark, arcing from lip to butt can like silent wayward meteorites. I propped myself on an elbow and looked out the window in the wall behind my bunk. Flakes of snow drifted in the glow of lights on poles, a soundless, dreamlike scene. I laid my head on my pillow and closed my eyes and was drifting like a snowflake myself when the shaking began. I thought I'd left seismic activity behind in the Bay Area, but when the inmate in the bunk below got his rocks off, it must have registered 6.5 on the Richter scale. Davis is still waiting to be assigned to a permanent facility, and he's starting to meet some of the other people that he's sharing this life with. He becomes acquainted with Lamar, and his perception of the world that he is entering begins to change. This is called The Best Laid Plans. And we've all had plans. You know what they say about plans. I opened my locker and removed my bag of books. I looked at each in turn and read its title and remembered when and where I had read it, then tossed it into the center of my bunk. John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, Graham Greene's A Burnt Out Case, Nelson Algren's A Walk on the Wild Side, Albert Camus' The Stranger, Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, Louise Ferdinand Celine's Journey to the End of the Night, J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, Paul Bowles' Let It Come Down, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Nietzsche's Will to Power, John Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. I had grabbed them off the shelf without thinking when packing to surrender, figuring the chance of finding a good book where I was going was low. But I wondered now if the selections were random after all. They seem to have in common the theme of alienation from society, the outsider motif, which was at odds with my newfound urge to engage with life. I couldn't choose. They were yesterday's news. I looked up and saw the black inmate on the top bunk across the aisle staring at me. He waved a book around and yelled something that was lost in the noise of the room. I motioned him over. He climbed down from his bunk, crossed the aisle, and came up alongside me. He was short. His hair was slicked back and shiny like that of a 50s Motown artist. He sported a matchstick-thin mustache, and one of his two front teeth was gold. The word dapper occurred to me. Trade you for a book, he said. He handed me a dog-eared paperback, Pimp, The Story of My Life by Iceberg Slim. What's it about, I said. It's about a brother named Robert Beck, he said, who was raised up by his mama in Chicago. He went to college, but he really wanted to be a pimp, so he'd go to pimp school on the streets and gets a degree in horology. He'd chump in a chilly-ass pimp till he'd get his coattails pulled by Sweet, the top-spade pimp in the country, the master Mac of all time. He pronounced of all time the way Muhammad Ali famously described himself as the greatest. He continued his recap of Pimp. Sweet told my man he got to be icy cold like the inside of a dead horse pussy, so he changed his name to Iceberg Slim. Soon he got a fine stable of bitches, got a tall pile of scratch, got a new shiny hog, got wines cost 200 sats apiece, but like my man say, a pimp's fame is as fleeting as an icicle under a blowtorch. One day he finds himself in the penitentiary, 43 years old. He ain't got shit to show for all them years of pimping. So he decided to square up and get his life right. Old boy get out the joint, move to California, and write this book. I opened the book at random and read, "Nigger, you're pretty, but a bleach cream will never be invented that will make you white. So pimp your ass off and be somebody with what you got. Could be worse, you could be an ugly nigger." I had taken black literature courses at San Francisco State, Zora Neale Hurston, James Baldwin, Richard Wright, Toni Morrison, but Iceberg Slim wasn't on the curriculum. "All right," I said, "pick a book." He scrambled up onto my bunk. He looked at the books and frowned. "Pick one for me," he said. I picked Of Mice and Men. "What's it about?" he said. "The title is a line from a poem," I said. "The best laid plans of mice and men often go awry." It's about planning a better life for yourself. He climbed down off my bunk. He held out his hand. Lamar Johnson, he said, I plan to be a pimp. Dean Davis, I said, I don't have a plan. Lamar shook his head. Brother, you don't know where you're going. You're going to wind up someplace else. I looked around the room. I'll keep that in mind, Lamar, I said. Lamar returned to his bunk with Of Mice and Men. I cracked open Pimp by Robert Beck, alias Iceberg Slim. I was soon immersed in another world, the mean streets of the Windy City, Chicago, circa 1930s and 40s, the world of the black pimp, a time of spats and slats and derby hats, of Billie Holiday and Billy Eckstein, of Sarah Vaughan, Nat King Cole, Zoot Sims, Charlie Bird Parker, of Packards and Duesenbergs, and Maggie and Jiggs comic books. When I looked up from the book, and rubbed my eyes and looked around the cell block, I felt I was emerging from one dream and entering another, the gauzy curtain between them no more substantial than the smoky haze that hung in the air. I tried to remember the sights and sounds of the life I'd left behind. The golden hills and the Marin headlands, the fog rolling in beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, the white caps on the water, the twinkling nightscape of San Francisco seen from across the bay, the pretty face of Lucy, the light in her almond eyes, her long legs, her dimpled derriere, the soft, sweet breath of Lola. But these too seemed like the smoky tendrils of a dissipating dream. I had the disquieting sense of embarking in a flimsy craft on a foggy sea to a distant foreign shore. I skipped the morning meal. By noon, I'd finished Pimp. I was impressed that when Beck sat down to write his book, he had something to say. That if he had become a writer first and gotten his degree from Tuskegee and read lots of books filled with fine writing of others and foregone the pimping game and never known the streets, he'd have become just another brilliant genius wordsmith with nothing real to write about. I felt fortunate to have read the book here in Arcadia, where the characters who peopled its pages milled around me in the flesh. The next morning. That bitch, that jazzy jive whore. My man Iceberg would have put his foot up her funky ass before he turned her out on the street. Lamar tossed Of Mice and Men onto my bunk. He continued his rant. That sissy bitch Curly, he better never ever go to East St. Louis. They'll turn his pussy ass out in a minute. And that lame ass George, why you gotta pop a cap on the ass of his own road doggy? He should have shot Crooks, that sorry-ass, busted-back, slop-toting nigger, sleeping in the barn like an animal and kissing the white man's ass. He better never go to East St. Louis, too. I smiled. Lamar's point of view is not one to be heard in a modern American literature class. How'd you like Pimp, Davis, he said. I liked it a lot, I said. I liked how Beck did it his way, even if he lost it all in the end. I liked how he squared up after and wrote a good book about it, but I didn't like how he made his money off women who don't feel good about themselves till they've got a foot up their ass. But that's just me. So, Lamar, how come you want to be a pimp if your man Iceberg decided it was a sick life and he squared up? Can't square up off something I ain't did yet, Lamar said. Makes sense, Lamar, I said. I could relate. Like Beck, I'd done it my way. I could hardly discourage Lamar from doing the same. What else you got to read, Davis, he said. You might like this, I said. I handed him For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. What's it all about, he said. It's about a named Robert Jordan who sacrificed his life for a bunch of wine-swilling gypsies. Lamar's eyes narrowed. Sound like a chump thing to do, don't it, Davis? Wasn't something you planned on doing, Lamar, I said, but shit happens. Lamar smiled, his gold tooth flashed. He said, ain't that a natural fact? We're going to move on here. Dean Davis has promised Lucy that he would be, he would fly under the radar, he would be the invisible man, out of sight, out of mind. But he soon runs afoul of the administration. He's asked to he's given a temporary assignment with the permanent slaughterhouse gang to slaughter pigs for the day, which he is willing to do until he finds out just how cruel and sadistic the slaughterhouse gang is, and especially the guard who is in charge of them, and how much they enjoy their job. So he declines to participate. He refuses to work, and if he refuses an assignment, well, he is given 1 week in solitary confinement in the hole. But he looks forward to the solitude and the chance to reflect on the situation, to be alone, solitude, meditate on the meaning of life. Afterwards, he reminisces. As an oasis of peace and tranquility, a refuge from the chaos of the general population, a place to park the soul and meditate on the meaning of life, solitary confinement had been a major disappointment. I was led in leg irons down a narrow concrete corridor below ground level with my cuffed hands in front of me holding 2 thin, raggedy blue blankets. Low watt bulbs and wire cages fixed to the ceiling lit the corridor with a dirty light. To my left was a windowless wall of concrete. To my right, a row of cells with barred doors behind which inmates shouted conversations with unseen neighbors or yelled obscenities at me as I passed. "What you looking at, cracker-ass motherfucker? Hey, white boy, suck my dick." I was shown to a cell so narrow I could touch both sides at the same time. On the left was a steel bunk without a mattress hung from the wall by chains, and at the rear, a low lidless toilet bowl and a stainless steel sink. I sat on the bunk and mulled the finite possibilities of a single pair of blankets. One doubled over and laid down on the bunk as a cushion for my hip, the other to cover with, and no pillow for my head. Or one to cover with, one to roll into a pillow, and no cushion between hip and cold hard steel. Or one to lie on, one to roll into a pillow, and none to cover with. There was no appealing option. So Dean Davis gets out and he's sent to a medium security prison, Lime Ridge State Penitentiary. And he soon realizes the futility of flying under the radar in his new home in this little passage called Captain Jack. Well, he confronts the reality of his new situation. The welcome committee wasted no time. I met them at the door. The tall one, with short blonde hair and a patch over one eye, introduced himself as Captain Jack and his brawny, bearded, tattooed partner as Bobo. "I'm Davis," I said. "That's Odom on the bunk." Odom sat up and blinked. I held out my hand. Captain Jack took it thumb grip style and pumped it like a piston. "All right," he said, "that makes 30 of us and only 70 of them." I wasn't sure if that was the score of a game that began before I arrived or an informal census. "What does?" I said. Captain Jack's smile faded. "What does what?" he said. I felt at a disadvantage, there being but a single eye to betray what the man was thinking. "What makes 30 of us and only 70 of them?" I said. "You and Odom do, Davis," Captain Jack said as though I was stupid. "2 more white boys makes 30 white boys and 70 niggers. Well, 60 niggers and 10 spicks, same fucking thing." Bobo nodded. "Yeah, same fucking thing," he said. I wondered how to respond without betraying my lack of sentiment for the demographics. Right, I said. "I can see how that might be important." I immediately regretted my tone. It was not convincing. Captain Jack's single eye narrowed. "It's not important to you, Davis?" "I haven't given it a lot of thought," I said. He released his grip. The corner of his lip pulsed in a poor imitation of Clint Eastwood's iconic quiver of contempt, which, should I attempt to do it for you? "You need to think about it real fast, Davis. The joint could jump any minute. Your ass is grass if no one's got your back." or do you think you can ride alone? I didn't know if I could ride alone, but I didn't like Captain Jack and I didn't like being pushed. I don't know, Captain Jack, I said. What do you think? I think when the shit hits the fan, Davis, you better know what color you are. Yeah, Davis, Bobo said, you better know what color you are. I'll keep that in mind, I said, and returned to my bunk. Captain Jack looked at Odom. What about you, Odom? You know what color you are? White as a bedsheet, Odom said, and a country boy to boot. I'd as soon kill them black sumbitches as look at them. You're our man, Odom, Captain Jack said. We'll see you around the camp. And you, Davis, you can bet I'll have my eye on you. What are we doing here? I've got to decide if I'm going to do one more for you. 5:39. Yes, I am. This will take 6 minutes. I'm going to include this because I want to make it clear that there were some very gnarly, unfriendly individuals to be dealt with, but there were just so many interesting characters who meant you no harm, who had a lot to say, who were aware of the story of their life that they were telling or living. And there was a kind of strange community of people sharing this common, bizarre life. One of the characters who was a friend and neighbor of Dean Davis's was Wilbur. This is called Is It Soup Yet? The ductwork that carried fresh air from cell to cell also served as a conduit for sound, especially after lockup when the block was relatively quiet. Then you could hear the strains of music wafting up from radios and boomboxes still playing, and sometimes the clacking of typewriter keys into the wee hours. Such was the case the night before I first met Wilbur. I thought the faint clacking that echoed each riff of my own on the keyboard was some kind of aberration, a warping of the atmosphere that caused the sound to be absorbed by, then released back into the night air, or a warping of the atmosphere between my ears, caused by the long succession of nights locked up and alone. Either way, when my passage on the keys was brief, it was followed by a brief rejoinder. When my passage was sustained, likewise its echo. This continued for a half hour, then ceased as though the warp in one atmosphere or another had corrected itself. The next evening, soon after I settled myself in and commenced typing, there was a knock at the door. I opened it on an inmate I had seen around but never talked to, a wiry, leprechaun-looking guy with a knobby chin, long nose and ears, and eyes set deep in the shadow of craggy brows. I fancied the man might have been born and raised in a tangle of gnarly tree roots. He smiled a crooked smile and said, "Is it soup yet?" "Is what soup yet?" I said. "What you're cooking up." "I'm not cooking up anything." "You know what I mean." "Afraid I don't," I said. "I write too," he said. "About what?" I said. "Necrophilia, doppelgangers, time and space, the living dead." "Did you hear me talking to you last night?" "No." "Through the ventilation system. Clickety-clack, clickety-clack." "Oh, that was you," I said. "Yes," he said, "I was letting you know that you're not alone." "I like alone," I said, "especially when I am." "We're fellow writers," he said. "We need each other." "I don't know about that," I said. "Let's read each other's stuff. What do you write?" "I keep a journal to pass the time," I said. "Character sketches, bits of dialogue, incidents and anecdotes, a boys on the block kind of thing. There's nothing for you to read." "You should write stories," he said. "Reality is boring. Too many rules. When you're doing hard time like I am, you want to create worlds where anything goes. Right now I'm writing the biography of Mother Goose. She wants it told, but she doesn't write, so I'm interviewing her in my cell. Sometimes in her cell. which is next to mine. I see, I said. Mother Goose is here in Lime Ridge, is she? Yes, he said, we're lucky to have her. She's a rare specimen. I'm doing her childhood first. I call it Bird Interrupted. When she asked me to write her story, I said, can I borrow a quill? But she didn't get the joke. I'm Wilbur, by the way. I'm Dean, I said. I know, he said. Dean Davis, a.k.a. Double D, busted for dope, doing a dime, a nickel with good time, address of record, San Francisco. You know more about me than I know about you, I said. I work in the captain's office, he said. I pull records. I know who's who and what's what. He looked around me into my cell. Nice typewriter, he said. IBM Selectric, I said, courtesy of my wife. It's a beauty, he said. I use a vintage Remington. It has the soul of an old machine. Would you like to read her bio when I'm done? Whose bio, I said. Of Mother Goose, he said. Are you listening? Sure, I said. I'd like to read it. It's not up to me, Wilbur said. It's up to her. She might not like you. I suppressed a laugh. Well, be sure and let me know, I said. You bet I will, Double D. We'll talk again. He glanced up and down the corridor and walked quickly away. From time to time, Wilbur would bring me a story to read. He'd knock softly, and when the door opened, his eyes would dart left and right like roaches when the lights come on. He'd pull the manuscript out from the front of his shirt and hand it to me and say, you'll like this, then walk away with his hands in his pockets and his head hanging low. His stories were eclectic and bizarre. Tales of animals that gave birth to humans, of humans who gave birth to animals, of mannequins that made it after the department store closed and gave birth to little mannequins, of plants and trees that uprooted themselves in the night and rearranged the forest floor, of a man and a dog who lived alone together and stared into each other's eyes until they traded places, and the man became the dog and sat at the feet of the dog who became the man and sat in the man's chair by the fireplace and smoked his pipe and thought the world was a mysterious place. Of planets that communicated with one another telepathically and told jokes about the planets and other galaxies. Of the oldest boulder in the world, which served as a repository of every thought, word, and deed of every sentient being on earth from the beginning to the end of time, and of the idiot savant who set out to find it. Of children who went missing for a day and returned with 100 years of knowledge and wisdom, which they had to conceal from grown-ups. His stories were a record of dream states and delirium. His sentences meandered for a quarter of a page with baffling metaphors and labyrinthine syntax, but always you came to the end of them with a head full of images and ideas, and with the feeling of having been somewhere outside yourself, which served one well who was strictly confined. I had been reluctant to read Wilbur's work at first, but soon found myself dropping by his cell, sticking my head in the door and saying, "Is it soup yet?" I'm going to read about a 1-minute passage and wrap this up. And I'm going to read this because it's important to know that after a certain amount of time, months, years, in this environment, it becomes your world. You're there 24 hours a day, and you are dealing with what is happening around you. It becomes your reality, and the world you left behind has been left behind, and you think far less about that world, even though you're going to be going back to it. You think less about that world than you do about what you're experiencing every day. And so this short passage demonstrates that. Dean has received a visit, one of his annual or semi-annual visits from Lucy. And he has described his life and what he does. And he's enthusiastic about talking about, Wilbur or, his relationship with other inmates. And Lucy says, "I'm worried about you, Dean. You're having too much fun in here. A line from a Crosby, Stills, and Nash tune ran through my head. If you can't be with the one you love, honey, love the one you're with. And it is, after all, a love story. I avoided further mention of life in Lime Ridge. Lucy could not relate, understandably so. I asked about Wally, her father. He'd only visited once. The place made him uncomfortable. He hated to see me here. He wrote occasionally, and he had subscribed me to the San Francisco Chronicle, knowing I loved the verbal pyrotechnics of Herb Caen. I asked after my brother Brody. He too had only visited once, but he took my calls, during which he complained about life and marveled at my enthusiasm for it. We discussed the antics of Lola and the trials and tribulations of raising a child alone. And when we had exhausted what few subjects were common to our disparate lives, the conversation stalled, and my thoughts wandered to life inside these walls. I wondered what they'd be serving in the chow hall for supper tonight. I hoped not what was laughably called Swiss steak. You could run a pencil through the arteries that were found inside a slab of it. I wondered if I'd go to the gym or the yard afterward. Likely the yard. I'd come to love these sultry Midwest summer evenings, the chirp of the crickets, the blink of the fireflies, the heat lightning sliding silent as prayer across a darkening sky. I wondered how I would render this visit in my journal tonight, when alone in the sanctuary of my cell, and which would seem more real to me in the future, the visit or my written account of it. And that is the dilemma of a writer in prison. Thank you for listening. Penitentiary Tales is available at all the usual online places, but we do encourage you to patronize your local bookstore. In the case of Jacksonville, that would be Rebel Heart Books, where you can get signed copies of Penitentiary Tales, or at Art Presence in Jacksonville also. And now I do welcome your questions, and there are no questions that are inappropriate or insensitive. Whatever's on your mind, whatever you'd like to know, I'd be happy to discuss. And thank you for stopping by.
Thank you, Gene. The first thing I'd like to say is that you can also get the book at Art Presence, and we welcome you there on 5th Street. This is the cover of Gene's book, and I want you to know that he did all the illustrations and the cover, and if you can see this, this is the view of Gene's cell that he painstakingly drew while sitting on the floor, as I remember, looking into your cell. It's a beautiful book. I am happy to say that David and I were very involved in the publication of this book with Gene through Lucky Valley. And as I said, I couldn't put it down. We do have time for a couple of questions. Gene, one of the main questions I have is, was there such a thing as white privilege inside?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. I remember one day I was in the cell of a fellow inmate, African-American inmate, and there were several of his pals were in there. And well, I don't know what the conversation was, but he said, we're all niggers in this place. So there was a kind of leveling effect. Everybody was the lowest of the low. But that said, the majority of the staff and the guards were white. And they were, a lot of them, local country boys. This was Southern Illinois, where the coal industry had fallen apart and jobs were scarce. And to get a job at the penitentiary, where you on the state's salary, was a very good thing. And so the guards did tend to favor and develop a rapport with white inmates, especially the more countrified inmates. I mean, if you're from Chicago and you might be white, but you might be Italian, and you might be very urban, and you don't have a whole lot of respect um, uh, for white guards who are from the country. But generally, yeah, there was some advantage to being white. I didn't really share that advantage though, because I just didn't fit the mold of someone that the white guards could benefit from. But it's just like, racism in America. Um, the people of color get the short end of the stick.
That's a fact. So this book was written as a novel, but it is a memoir, partially, I suppose. And so can you tell us how many of these stories are true and how many are kind of gathered from your experiences and pulled in from the sky? I mean, they're really based on your day-to-day life.
I would say 80%. 80% of them really occurred, but there's a process where you take an actual event from your, the reservoir of your experience, from your memories, and you take those incidents and those moments, and you transform them into fiction. So you're free to do whatever you want. And so I'd say that 80% of the incidents in the book actually occurred, but they have been transformed into something slightly different so that it can be called fiction. And perhaps 20% of the events and 20% of the characters did not exist and never occurred, and they were strictly the product of my imagination. And then a lot of the characters were composite characters. Mm. They were archetypes or examples of the kind of character that were there. So 80-20.
Okay. So did you ever feel like your life was in danger?
No. I did feel, I want to give you an example. The last couple of months that I was there, and this is, I was in the honor dorm. There are only 25 people in the honor dorm, and 24 of them were there for murder. I was the only one who wasn't. I felt no sense of danger at all, for a few reasons. One, and I think statistics bear it out, that the least likely crime to be repeated is that of homicide, because most of the time people kill somebody they know, and or in a state of emotional rage, distraught, and it's not likely to be repeated again. And I found that most of the people who were there for that were not hostile. They had no interest in hurting me. But there were some people who could care less about me, and they would hurt me or another inmate in a minute. Mm-hmm. But yet I still did not feel that danger because of an approach that I had, which was, and I point this out in the book on numerous occasions, that giving respect and recognition to your fellow man is what they crave. And you start out with a lousy childhood, and you're totally during those periods in your childhood when you're supposed to get love and a sense of humanity and you don't get that, you don't get the respect and recognition and the reinforcement that little kids ought to have, that need is still there. And so giving that to a person goes a long way towards establishing a relationship with them, whereby they have no reason at all to harm you.
Mm.
And so that approach served me well, and I never felt that anybody wanted to hurt me. There's one character, and I didn't do any reading behind this, any excerpts that involve this character. His name is Botha, B-O-T-H-A. He's a composite character. He represented the kind of unbridled and unmitigated hostility towards the world, towards authority, and especially towards white people, and he singled me out. And I had to deal with that. And so what we had was, in the book, 5 years of an adversarial relationship whereby he resented me to the extreme because I was able to enjoy life and have the kind of white privilege that made him hate. And so he singled me out and targeted his hostility towards me. And so there's this theme that runs through the narrative, this thread runs through the narrative of this adversarial relationship. And it's very interesting, I think, that how it worked out. And I do invite anyone who hasn't read it to read it and to keep that in mind, that this is a important theme of the book. So two things. One, how you treat other people is what you're going to, what you're going to get back. No, that's it. So no, I never felt my life was in danger.
Okay, thank you. I have, it's 6 o'clock. Our time is running out, but I do have one more question. And that is, what was the most difficult or perhaps the most painful thing to write about?
This book is a sort of a kind of what they call metafiction. Metafiction being a book or a story, the subject of which is the book or the story. So Penitentiary Tales is a story about the genesis of Penitentiary Tales. So while I'm keeping my journal and writing about these characters, it occurs to me that there's something almost cold and cynical about the fact that I know that I'm going home in 4 or 5 years, and most of these people are not, and many of them are going to die behind the walls. And here I am having a good old time, sort of, on a daily basis, knowing that in a few years I'm going back to, well, Dean Davis is going back to Marin County, California, and is going to exercise white privilege. And these years are going to be dismissed. He can still go on and be the CEO of a corporation. He can be a lawyer. He can be a college professor. And they can't and they won't. And what he's intending to do, or playing with the idea of doing, is taking his journal and transforming it into a collection of tales about their lives. And he feels a little guilty about the fact that he might benefit. It's almost like selling postcards of the hanging, a little tune from Bob Dylan. He's going to go out and maybe benefit by taking these stories and making them available to privileged readers for their enjoyment, their reading pleasure. Mm. And they can read about it, and then they can put the book down and then go about their business do their stock market and their 401ks, go eat at nice restaurants in Sausalito or Tiburon. When these guys, year by year, one or more of them are dying. So that was one of the hardest things that Dean Davis experienced, and that was a concern of mine also. Should I even be doing this? Should I be writing this journal and then go out and get an MFA, write a book, have this moment that we're having now? Well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gene. It's such a gripping story and strikes the heart in such a real way. It's gnarly, but it's true. The gist of it is really true. So we thank you. And I'd like to remind everyone that you can get Penitentiary Tales at Art Presence next to the courthouse in Jacksonville or at Rebel Heart. But we want you to come to Art Presence, of course. So please come and visit us there at Art Presence on 5th Street next to the courthouse in Jacksonville. And Gene, we thank you so much for being with us tonight. We look forward to your next book about something completely different, I'm sure. Thank you all for coming, and we will see you again in a month. Take care.